Rancher helps neighbor without wanting anything in return, but she's keeping a secret no one would ever imagine. When Madison stopped the car in front of the old house, the first thing she did was look around to make sure no one was watching. It wasn't the gesture of someone arriving somewhere new. It was the gesture of someone who had come to carry out a mission, and her mission had a name: Caleb. The house sat at the end of a dirt road in a small town called Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone and news traveled faster than the wind. The property next door was a medium-sized ranch, with a barn of wood darkened by time and a large, well-tended vegetable garden she could see from far away, even before stepping onto her own land. It was a pretty garden. Madison shouldn't have paid attention to it, but she did. In the first few days, she stayed in the house, organizing things, trying to make sense of the layout, opening the windows to air out the musty smell. The house had been abandoned for years. There was a leak in one of the bedrooms, a window that wouldn't close properly, and a pipe under the kitchen sink that dripped with a stubbornness that felt personal. It was the pipe that brought Caleb over for the first time. She was crouched under the sink with a basin underneath the pipe and the look of someone who had absolutely no idea what she was doing, when she heard a voice from outside. It was a deep voice, a little rough, the kind that doesn't rush. "Neighbor, you doing all right in there?" She lifted her head, bumped it on the sink, put a hand to her head with a half-suppressed ow, and went to the door. On the doorstep stood a man in his mid-50s. A worn, flat-brimmed cap, an olive-green apron over a long-sleeved denim shirt, hands marked by years of working the land. He had a smile at the corner of his mouth, the kind of calm smile of a man who has seen a lot in life and learned not to be startled by much. "Caleb," he said, extending his hand, "I'm your neighbor. Saw your car here a few days ago and figured I'd stop by to introduce myself." She looked at his hand for a second before shaking it. "Madison. The house giving you trouble?" "A little," she replied, not wanting to give details. But the sound of the dripping water was audible from outside, and Caleb, without needing an invitation, leaned slightly to get a look at what was going on inside the kitchen. "Is it the sink pipe?" "Yeah. I've got a pipe wrench out in the barn. I can have that fixed in 5 minutes." She wanted to say she didn't need it, that she'd call someone, that everything was fine. But the words got stuck in her throat because, looking at that man, she couldn't find a single concrete reason to say no. He wasn't asking for anything. He had no visible intention beyond helping, and that, in a strange way, made her even more suspicious. Madison was 32, with long brown hair and a way of dressing that didn't fit in with that place. A black blazer, sharply pressed pants, small earrings. The people in the small town had already noticed. They always do in places like that. Caleb fixed the pipe in less than 10 minutes. He grabbed the wrench, tightened the fitting that had loosened over time, checked a few other spots under the sink, and left without even asking for a glass of water. Madison stood in the middle of the kitchen, watching him walk away down the dirt road, and felt something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more complicated than that, because Madison hadn't come to that small town to make friends. She had come to find answers about a man who, according to Aunt Martha, had swindled her, about a promise never kept, about money that, according to the numbers her aunt had put together over the years, should be hers. And the man who held that truth was named Caleb. The neighbor who had just fixed her pipe and walked away smiling, without asking for absolutely anything. She didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, Caleb showed up 2 more times, one to say there was a basil seedling left over and to ask if she wanted it, another to warn that a heavy rain was coming that night and that the window in the back bedroom, which he'd noticed was open, was going to let water in. Nothing more than that. Each visit lasted less than 5 minutes. He never entered the house without being invited. Madison began to notice that Caleb was known throughout the neighborhood. When she went to the general store for the first time, the woman at the counter asked if she was Mr. Caleb's new neighbor. When she stopped to ask for directions on the street, the man who answered said, "Oh, right there near Caleb's ranch." The man seemed to be everywhere without going anywhere. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that he showed up with the pot. Madison was sitting at the kitchen table with printed documents in front of her, papers she had folded and refolded from handling them so much, when she heard the usual knock at the door. Light. Twice. She went to it. Caleb was on the threshold holding a large stainless steel pot, the kind you use when you cook for a lot of people. It was full. She could feel the weight by the way he held it, a folded kitchen towel over the top to keep it warm. "I made some vegetable broth. Made too much for just me," he said with that crooked smile. "If you don't like it, don't stand on ceremony. Throw it out." Madison stood looking at the pot. "Come in," she said, not really knowing why. Caleb came in, put the pot on the stove, and as he took the kitchen towel off the top, she smelled it. A strong, warm smell of herbs and thick broth and butter, and something she couldn't identify right away, but that made something stir inside her. Not in her recent memory, in a much deeper memory, the kind we carry without knowing they're there. She closed her eyes for a second. "What herb did you use?" Caleb looked at her with a curiosity that wasn't quite surprise. "Celery and a little rosemary, plus some seasonings I learned from a friend of mine a long time ago." He paused. "Do you know that smell?" "I don't know," she said slowly. "I think so. I don't remember where from." He didn't insist. He served the broth in a bowl, wished her a good meal and left. But that last sentence kept spinning in her head for the rest of the day. A friend. A long time ago. That night, she opened the boxes that were stacked in the back bedroom, boxes that had come with the house when she bought it, full of old papers the former resident hadn't removed. She had put off opening those boxes because she knew that once she did, things would become more real. The first box had old receipts, notebooks, the kind of thing any house accumulates. The second had yellowed photographs. The third had letters. She picked up the letters carefully. The envelopes were thin paper, written on with a pen pressed down hard, some with large, slightly uncertain handwriting. They weren't letters for her. They were old letters, from decades ago, that had been left forgotten there. Everyday things between the woman of the house and a friend from another town, but in an unaddressed envelope, folded at the bottom of the box as if someone had wanted to hide it without quite knowing where, she found a photo. The photo showed two young men in their early 20s leaning against a wire fence, laughing. One of them she didn't recognize. The other she had to look at for a while because the face had about 3 decades less and the smile was wider. But it was unmistakable. It was Caleb. And the man next to him had a way of carrying his body, something in his face that took her a while to understand why she recognized. When she understood, she dropped the photo on the table as if it had burned her fingers. It was her father. "Look, when I found out about that part, I stood still for a while before I could keep going, because you think you know where the story is headed, and then it turns in a way you didn't expect." Madison stayed up all night. She kept looking at the photo, then at the documents she had brought, then at the photo again. Her father, Arthur, had been a friend of Caleb. He wasn't just a name in the story Aunt Martha used to tell. He was a close friend, a young, laughing friend, leaning against a fence with the man who was now her neighbor at the ranch. In the morning, she called Aunt Martha. "I found a photo of Dad with Caleb." Silence on the other end. "What photo?" "A photo of the two of them together, young. They knew each other, Martha. Madison, everyone knows everyone in these small towns. That doesn't mean anything. You told me he was a stranger who took advantage of Dad when he was vulnerable." "He did take advantage. Even if they knew each other before, that doesn't change what he did." Her aunt's voice had that usual firmness, that firmness Madison had learned to mistake for certainty. But this time she noticed something different in that voice. "Hurry," as if Martha wanted to shut the subject down before it grew too big. "You knew they were friends," Madison said. It wasn't a question. "Take it easy, girl. You've been there for a short time, and you're already letting that man fool you with kindness. That's exactly how he operates. That's exactly what he did to your father." Madison hung up the phone. She stayed in the kitchen for a while, looking out the window at the ranch next door. Caleb was there, in the vegetable garden, crouched down, working the soil with his hands, with that cap, with that calm manner of a man who owes nothing to anyone. And she didn't know what to think. In the days that followed, she went to him. not to accuse, just to observe. She started accepting the invitations he made in passing, once to see the vegetable garden, another time to have coffee on the porch. Caleb spoke little about himself. He talked more about the land, the cycles of the crops, the rains that had come late that year. Every now and then he mentioned his son who lived in a big city and came to visit every couple of months. And one afternoon when they were sitting on the porch with coffee in hand, for no particular reason, Caleb looked at the ranch the way you look at something you've cared for a long time and said, "I inherited this piece of land from a friend of mine, not by blood, by life." Madison held her cup with both hands. "What do you mean?" "The land was his. When he got sick and couldn't run the ranch anymore, he sold it to me. But he sold it the way a friend sells, for what it was worth to him, not what it was worth on the market. And with one condition." She said nothing. She let the silence do the work. "He had a daughter, someone he hadn't seen in years, because of a falling out with his ex-wife's family. He asked me to hold on to part of the money, a portion he had set aside, for that daughter. He asked me to keep it until she showed up, or until I found her." Madison felt the coffee going cold in her hand. "And you kept it?" "I keep it to this day." It took her a while to speak again. "Why did you never go after that girl?" "I did, 3 times. I went to the address he gave me. I talked to her aunt. The aunt told me the girl didn't want anything that came from her father, that she had turned the page, that it was better to leave it alone." Madison closed her eyes. Aunt Martha. It had been Martha who blocked the contact. It had been Martha who told her whole life that her father was a distant and irresponsible figure. It had been Martha who turned Caleb into the villain of the story. So Madison would never go looking, so the money would never reach her. And a horrible thought, the kind that hurts because it's true, came slowly. Aunt Martha knew very well that that money existed, and she knew who was holding on to it. "Caleb," she said with the firmest voice she could manage. "What was the friend's name?" He turned his face to her, and in that moment, she saw that he already knew. He had known from the start. From the day she'd shown up at his door with that way about her, with that face he must have recognized without understanding where from, and then understood all too well. "Arthur," he said, "just like that. There are things you hear, and you feel like you know that pain from somewhere. That part got me in a way I can't quite explain." Madison didn't cry there on the porch. She held it in. She walked off, crossed the dirt road, and went into the house. And only when she closed the door did she let it out. It wasn't a loud cry. It was that quiet cry of someone who finally understands something they didn't before, and understanding hurts more than doubt. She spent the night reorganizing everything in her head. Aunt Martha had built an entire narrative, the narrative of a father who didn't care, of a man who had wronged the family, of an inheritance lost in the wrong hands. And the truth, stored in a wooden barn, 100 yards from her house, was exactly the opposite. Her father had cared. He had left something for her, and the only one who had honored that promise was Caleb. The next day she went to see him before breakfast. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now continuing, he was in the kitchen, tending to something on the stove. When she knocked on the door, he opened it without rushing, as always. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." He opened the door wider and motioned for her to come in. She walked in, stood in the middle of the kitchen, and took a deep breath. "Arthur was my father. I came here because my aunt convinced me that you had done something wrong to his family. I came to confront you, to find some proof that her story was true." Caleb stood still for a moment. Then he went to the table and pulled out a chair. "Sit down." "I didn't come—" "Sit down, Madison. I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time." She sat down. He went to the bedroom and came back with a cardboard box that had seen better days, the edges folded, old tape trying to hold one of the sides together. He placed the box on the table carefully, like someone placing something precious. "There are 3 things in here," he said, sitting in the chair across from her. A savings account with the amount your father asked me to keep safe, plus the interest from all these years. An envelope with the document he drew up notarized, explaining the terms of the reserve. And letters. Madison looked at the box. Letters? Your father wrote to you, for years. He sent them to me to keep, because there was no way to send them directly. He knew Martha intercepted everything. Caleb paused. He knew that one day you would show up. He didn't know when, but he knew. She couldn't open the box there, not in front of him. She took the box home and stood at the kitchen table for almost an hour before she had the courage to open the envelope with the letters. There were 12 letters. The first was from when she was 7 years old. The last was from a few months before her father passed. She recognized the date by the handwriting, which had grown a bit shakier, but the tone hadn't changed. It was a father writing to a daughter he loved and couldn't reach, explaining what had happened between him and her mother's family, asking her not to hold resentment against those who didn't deserve to carry that resentment, saying, in the last letter, that he had asked Caleb to take care of a piece that was rightfully hers. And in a sentence she read 3 times, "When you find Caleb, my daughter, you'll understand that true friendship has no expiration date. He's a man of his word, and words from men like him last forever." I don't know about you, but that phrase stuck in my head for a long time after reading it. Sometimes we discover we were loved in a way that never reached us, and that's one of the hardest things to process there is. It took her 3 days to call Aunt Martha again. 3 days organizing what she was going to say, how she was going to say it, where to find the balance between the anger she had and the need to understand. When she called, she was direct. "I know everything, Martha." On the other end, silence. "I know you knew about the money. I know you told Caleb I didn't want contact, and I know about the letters Dad wrote that never reached me. Madison, you're being—" "No." Her voice wasn't loud. It was cold. Sometimes cold is worse than loud. "I don't want to fight. I want to understand. Why did you do this?" Her aunt's answer came slowly, after a silence that said more than any words would. "I raised you. I'm the one who stayed. Your father disappeared when you needed him most. He didn't disappear. He was blocked. Things aren't that simple. They were simple enough for you to hide letters from a child." Her voice broke slightly at the end, but she continued. "I'm not going to hate you, Martha. You raised me and I know that. But I needed to tell you that I know, and that I'm not going to pretend I don't." Martha tried to justify herself. She said she had done what she thought was best, that Madison's father wasn't perfect, that things between them were more complicated than they seemed. Madison listened, responded calmly, and ended the call when she felt she had said what she needed to say. She stood still in the kitchen after hanging up. Through the window, she could see the ranch next door. She could see the vegetable garden, the barn, the thin smoke rising from the chimney every afternoon when Caleb cooked. And she thought about the smell of that broth he had brought on the first day, the smell she had recognized without knowing where from. Now she knew. It was the smell of her father's kitchen, from when she was little and still lived with him, before everything fell apart. A memory stored in a place she didn't know existed, and that Caleb, without knowing, or maybe knowing, had awakened with a pot of broth on the stove and a half smile. She went to the door, crossed the dirt road, and knocked on the ranch door. Caleb opened it, looked at her. "You read the letters," he said. "I did." He gestured for her to come in. Madison sat at his kitchen table, the same table where everything had begun, with the big pot and the smell that had touched her, without her understanding why. And the two of them talked for a time she later couldn't measure. He told her about his friendship with Arthur, told her about the years they had worked together in the beginning, before each went their own way, told her how hard it had been to honor a promise without knowing if it would ever lead anywhere. And she, for the first time since she had arrived in Willow Creek, talked about herself, about the life she had built in Chicago, about the career that had consumed everything and that suddenly seemed too small, about the desire to understand who she was before deciding who she was going to be. Caleb listened without interrupting, the way few people listen. At the end of the afternoon when she left, He stood at the ranch door watching her cross the road, and she heard him say, without making a fuss, almost to himself, "Your father would have liked you today." She didn't turn around, but she stopped for a second. Then she kept walking, with a lighter heart than when she had arrived. In the months that followed, Madison didn't leave. She stayed. She fixed up the house slowly, planted the basil Caleb had given her, learned to work the soil in a way she never imagined she would learn. She took care of the paperwork her father had left behind, talked to Caleb about the money, which, by her decision, stayed as a fund for when she decided what to do with the future. And on a Saturday morning, when she was on the porch with a coffee and the sun still low, a car she didn't recognize came up the dirt road. A woman got out, elderly in her mid-70s, white hair cut short, a way of walking that said she had made far more difficult decisions than most people could imagine over a lifetime. Madison stood still. The woman came to the gate. "You're Madison, right?" "I am." "I'm Eleanor. I was a friend of your grandmother's." She paused with that calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation inside herself for a long time. "I was the one who put this house up for sale and made sure you would know it was available. I did it because your father, before he left, asked me to." A discreet smile, the kind that carries a lot inside. "He knew you would find Caleb. He just didn't know exactly when." Madison stood looking at that woman for a while. There were people, she was realizing, who spend their whole lives working in silence to fix what others break, who keep promises made decades ago without asking for recognition, who stay behind the scenes, waiting for the right moment, because they know forcing things never works. Her father had known these people, he had trusted them, and they had honored that trust with a loyalty she was still learning to understand. She opened the gate. "Would you like some coffee?" Mrs. Eleanor came in with that easygoing manner of someone who knows she'll be staying a while. End of story. Sometimes we spend years carrying a half-finished story, with an invented villain, with a longing that has no name, with the feeling that something was missing and we'll never know what. And then on an ordinary day, in a small town that wasn't in the plans, the smell of vegetable broth on the stove arrives and everything shifts. If this story touched something inside you, tell us about it down in the comments. Where are you watching from? Do you think Madison made the right decision in staying? I'd love to know. Thank you so much for keeping me company as always. Don't forget to like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.